He's trying to revive a team that hasn't won a game in 2 years. I'm Ilya Maritz, host of The Season, WNYC's new podcast about winning, losing, and what it takes to change the score, told in real time. Listen at wnyc.org/theseason.
WNYC support comes from Manhattan Theater Club, presenting the Broadway premiere of Fool for Love by Sam Shepard, starring Nina Arianda and Sam Rockwell, and directed by Daniel Aukin. Now in previews. Tickets at manhattantheaterclub.com.
Coming up next on WNYC, it's The Takeaway on 93.9 FM. On AM 820, it's The World. Another warm day, sunny with highs in the upper 80s. Tonight, mostly clear with a low around 67 degrees. Looking ahead to your weekend, Saturday, mostly sunny with a high near 82. Sunday, lovely as well, but we do have a chance of showers and a possible thunderstorm with a high near 80 degrees. Right now, it is breezy and warm, 85 degrees in Central Park at 3 o'clock.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York. Just keep listening.
Come together right now over climate change.
This will be the first climate agreement where all countries are going to be putting forward their own pledges to address climate change. So it stands to be a very important agreement.
A discussion of how all cooperation on global warming may actually be local. Doing the math. 1 and 1 and 1 is 3. I'm John Hockenberry, and this is The Takeaway. Also, refugees and migrants try to get the attention of presidents and popes. And the Earth's cry for help in sounds that are slowly disappearing. Share what you know at 877-8MyTake or tweet us at The Takeaway.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The flash floods along the Utah-Arizona border this week are turning out to be among the deadliest in recent memory. 20 people now confirmed dead. NPR's Howard Burkus reports the latest known victim is a 33-year-old Utah man.
The sheriff's office in Mojave County, Arizona, says the body of Ryan Mertlich of Hurricane, Utah, was found in flash flood debris 6 miles downstream from his battered car. Relatives told searchers Mertlich was headed home Monday and often drove the remote dirt roads of an area known as the Arizona Strip. The roads there often dip into dry washes that can become raging torrents during flash floods. The search continues for a 6-year-old boy still missing in the deadliest flash flood this week. 9 children and their 3 mothers are confirmed dead in that incident in Hilldale, Utah. 7 more people died in yet another flash flood in Zion National Park. Howard Burkus, NPR News, Salt Lake City.
Authorities say 6 of the 7 hikers killed in the fast-moving floodwaters in Zion National Park were from Southern California. 1 was from Nevada. It's reported that some of the group of men and women were new to climbing and swimming through narrow canyons. A second person is charged in connection with June's shooting rampage at a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. NPR's Debbie Elliott says Joey Meek was arraigned today in Columbia to answer charges that he lied to federal investigators about what he knew of Dylann Roof's alleged plans to commit murder. 21-year-old Joey Meek pleaded not guilty to charges of concealing knowledge of a felony and making a false statement to the FBI. A federal grand jury indictment accuses Meek of telling an FBI agent he didn't know the specifics of Dylann Roof's alleged plan to shoot members of an historic African-American church in Charleston, when in fact Meek knew otherwise. Meek has said that Roof, an old school friend, had stayed at Meek's mobile home in the weeks leading up to the June mass shooting at Emmanuel AME Church. He described Roof drinking and talking about starting a race war. Roof, who is white, is charged with killing 9 black church members during Bible study. Debbie Elliott, NPR News. A military investigator says Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl now says he did a stupid thing but meant well when he walked away from his post more than 5 years ago in Afghanistan, a decision that led to his capture by the Taliban. Major General Kenneth Dahl says he believes Bergdahl thought he could raise attention to what he saw as serious problems with commanders of his platoon. NPR's Wade Goodwin says Dahl then delivered a stunning assessment on whether the soldier should go to prison for desertion and misbehavior before the enemy.
The defense lawyers asked if he had an opinion as to whether Sergeant Bergdahl should be imprisoned. And the Major General said, I don't believe that Sergeant Bergdahl should be imprisoned. I don't believe a prison sentence would be appropriate in this case.
That's NPR's Wade Goodwin reporting. Dow is down 253 points, 1.5%. This is NPR News.
This is WNYC at 3:04. I'm Jamie Floyd. In New Jersey, the Christie administration has filed a motion to block environmental groups from appealing the state's $225 million settlement with ExxonMobil. Those groups say the state is getting too little in the settlement, considering an earlier estimate of nearly $9 billion in damages from dozens of polluted sites. New Jersey sued ExxonMobil in 2004 for pollution dating back decades. The reported resignation of board chairman Ron Perlman has exposed disharmony at Carnegie Hall. The billionaire businessman quit because of disagreements with executive director Clive Gillinson, whom Perlman says has a, quote, troubling lack of transparency. William Cohen covers the financial industry and business leaders.
This is a big issue for cultural institutions all across the city, is to continually raise more money. And so that involves billionaires and people with big egos. And so you're inevitably going to have clashes.
Perlman has served as chair of the board for just 6 months. And ridership is up on the Staten Island Ferry following a recent service expansion. The increase was reported in the mayor's management report for fiscal year 2015. Ridership rose 4% over the previous year to 21.9 million, according to the Staten Island Advance. The city did not directly link the increase to expansion, but it does come after more overnight and weekend trips were added to the schedule. It's going to be sunny for the rest of the day, very warm as it has been all week. Highs in the mid-80s, mostly clear tonight, lows near 68. Right now it's sunny, 83 degrees at 4:06.
Support for NPR comes from America's Natural Gas. Learn how Georgia Power reduced emissions at its power plant using natural gas. Thinkaboutit.org.
5 years ago, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg donated $100 million to turn around Newark schools. Now we're asking, how was the money spent and did it help? I'm Jamie Floyd, host of All Things Considered on WNYC. Join me, Newark Mayor Ross Baraka and School Superintendent Chris Cerf for a free community discussion Monday, September 28th at NJ PAC. Reservations at WNYC.org/events.
This is The Takeaway. I'm John Hockenberry. Thanks so much for listening. Conflict and cooperation, conflict or cooperation. Much of what passes for news or episodes in the urgent story of human conflict around the world or the hopeful story of human cooperation to solve global problems. There's a big idea for this Friday. The unresolved conflicts in the Middle East reveal an apparent inability of nations to cooperate over what to do about refugees fleeing into Europe. Just yesterday, we reported how Croatia was responding to closed borders in Hungary by welcoming a few thousand Syrian refugees. In 24 hours, though, these few thousand have become a flood of perhaps 10,000, and Croatia now has reportedly closed its borders with Serbia, creating a stateless limbo for more people displaced by war. In this century, as we've noted many times, the failure of international institutions to prevent or resolve military conflicts has produced a refugee crisis numbering more than 60 million, to which we can add the more than 1.2 million new refugees from an insurgent war in Nigeria. The UN says most of them are fleeing the terrorist group Boko Haram. Most of them are children under the age of 5, and at least 500,000 have been displaced in just the past 5 months. Is this unprecedented shift of population beyond the capacity of international cooperation, or can nations gradually mobilize to take care of the millions now on the move? For an assessment, we turn to Ryan Crocker, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, now dean and executive professor at the George Bush School of Government and Public Policy at Texas A&M University. Ambassador, welcome to The Takeaway.
Thank you, John.
Mr. Ambassador, 20 former senior officials from the State Department, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, among other agencies, have sent a letter to President Obama and congressional leaders, and they're asking for more money for resettling Syrian refugees in the United States and accepting up to 100,000 Syrian refugees. The current U.S. cap is at 70,000. Do you support this request?
I signed that letter and was very proud to do so. As you noted earlier, this is a global crisis. It is a crisis that very much involves the United States. It is not a European problem or an African problem or a Middle Eastern problem. It's a problem for all of us. And it is a problem that is only going to be effectively treated if the United States leads.
Drawing on your capacity as former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, your colleague Colin Powell once said, talking about the U.S. invasion of Iraq, if you break it, you own it. That's ancient history now, but I'm wondering if some of the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of broken families making their way to Europe are owned in some sense by the U.S. invasion of Iraq, destabilizing the region, destabilizing Syria, leading to many of the problems that we are seeing, and that there is a moral dimension to the U.S. taking more of a role here.
I learned maybe two things in 40 years in the Foreign Service. The first is be careful what you get into. The Middle East is a complicated place if you decide you're going to play in that sport. The second thing is be just as careful what you propose to get out of. That disengagement can have consequences as great or greater than that initial engagement. I would suggest to you that in Iraq, we were not careful going in 2003, and we were not careful coming out in 2011.
Is the president getting something wrong by being too careful in thinking about U.S. commitments on the military side and not being bold enough in thinking about U.S. responsibilities on the moral side, worried about getting involved in military conflict against ISIS in Syria without worrying about the global consequences of the refugees that we're seeing in Europe?
I again, would implore the president to realize that this is a moral imperative. It's also a national security imperative. However you define or describe it, you have to show leadership. In dealing with this refugee crisis, it does not require right now that anybody send in military divisions. It does require that we work with the Europeans and with others to see that refugees are dealt with humanely, and we need to lead by example.
There are reports now that the U.S. is ready to begin military-to-military talks with Russia about the situation in Syria. Does that amount to essentially a Russian-U.S. negotiated surrender to Bashar al-Assad, essentially allowing him to keep power, a real change in the regime change policy that the president was talking about just a few years ago?
The Russians have a policy in Syria. It's a dreadful policy from any standpoint, but it's coherent in its own terms. They're all in supporting Bashar al-Assad. We don't have a policy in Syria. So if we are going to talk to the Russians, I think we better have a policy first, so that you have a conversation that sounds something like President Obama telling President Putin that as you contemplate what you're going to do in Syria, I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. I'm going to impose a no-fly zone. The barrel bombs that have killed tens of thousands and have driven hundreds of thousands of others out of the country as refugees are going to stop. And by the way, I can impose that no-fly zone without using aircraft. I can do it with missiles. So think about what you're going to do. Maybe it's time for you and your thug friend Bashar to come to the table. And time for him to go, because we're coming in.
Ambassador Crocker, I heard the commander of CENTCOM on Capitol Hill talking about the possibility of safe zones for Syrians inside the areas of Iraq and Syria that are controlled by ISIS, on the border between ISIS-controlled territory and Kurdistan. And it seemed to me that both CENTCOM doesn't quite know where the administration is headed here, and that the notion of safe zones is a kind of a capitulation to ISIS, that apparently we've quietly agreed to allow ISIS to exist in that region. Do you see it that way?
I'm not quite sure what General Austin's concept of a safe zone is. To me, if the zone is to be truly safe, someone has to defend and protect it. That means boots on the ground. Is General Austin proposing that U.S. forces go in to secure a safe zone? If that's what we're talking about, that's a major shift in our policy. Syria is the problem from hell. You have ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the one hand, and you have Bashar al-Assad on the other. I think we have got to step up a campaign against both.
Ryan Crocker is former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. He's now dean and executive professor at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Thanks so much, Ambassador.
Thank you.
The very same questions about international cooperation and responsibility we were just discussing with Ambassador Crocker can also be asked about the capacity of nations to cooperate over the urgent consequences of another global problem, climate change. From the high-profile climate summits like the Kyoto Protocol that failed to bring nations together on global warming, to more recent regional efforts, this century will test whether nations can get serious about that urgent matter that knows no national borders and has consequences for all.
While the reality of climate change is not in doubt, I have to be honest, as the world watches us today, I think our ability to take collective action is in doubt right now.
That's President Obama speaking at the Copenhagen Climate Summit back in 2009. There's a new round of talks scheduled for December in Paris, and gradually there's been an understanding that international cooperation from the ground up may be a better model for success on global warming than the traditional summit approach. Joining us is Rebecca Lefton, Director of Policy and Research at Climate Advisors. That's a Washington, D.C. consulting firm. Rebecca, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you think is going on? Are the relationships changing in this discussion of climate change, and is all cooperation local on climate change? You've seen China and the U.S. Getting together bilateral when they have a lot of things to disagree about, but maybe not so much on climate change. What do you think?
What we're seeing is a new level of cooperation between major emitting economies, and this is something that President Obama has been doing, especially in the second part of his administration. President Obama has really been elevating climate change into foreign policy with major emitting economies, including China and India and Brazil, because working with these countries that are some of the leading major emitters is really essential.
Here's Vice President Joe Biden at the U.S.-China Summit Leaders Conference in Los Angeles this month.
We share in common the belief that the United States-Chinese relationship is critical to the peace and prosperity and absolutely essential to fight climate change.
Would you say, Rebecca, that if China and the United States continue to talk about these targets seriously, that it encourages cities to cooperate bilaterally in their own targets or in improving the climates on their own streets?
Oh, absolutely. So Vice President Biden was speaking about the recent agreement between the U.S. and China, where 30 cities and 30 Chinese and U.S. cities agreed to cooperate on climate change. And we're going to see more and more of these types of local level and regional cooperation between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and other countries on climate change. There are a lot of ways that cities can cooperate to share best practices, and cities are really invested in ensuring that they're going to be protected from the impacts of climate change, because that's where the impacts are really felt. They're felt at the local level.
Rebecca Lefton, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Rebecca Lefton, Director of Policy and Research at Climate Advisors, a Washington, D.C. climate consultancy firm, talking about what's at stake in the upcoming Paris Summit on climate change. As we think about the global political challenges for maintaining progress on climate change, we should note that really all climate change is local. Local in the vanished wildlife, the severe weather trends, the wildfire devastation being seen in the American West right now. It's a story that can be told in vanishing bird songs, silent rivers, and radically transformed sound pictures of places where ancient sounds of nature are crowded out by the sounds of human settlements. Have you ever thought about the background sound you would hear if you stripped away the noises you make in your own daily life? What's the background sound in your own audio portrait?
This is Jen in Austin, Texas. I actually leave my local NPR station on the radio all day. And when I have to leave, I keep it on so that my little dog can listen to it. And I think it makes her a little bit smarter every day.
Boston says, my kid's incessant use of video games. From Pennsylvania, I work in a pharmaceutical lab, and the hum of the negative 70 degrees Celsius freezers is enough to lull even the most severe insomniac to sleep.
This is Nancy from Massachusetts. In the background right now, I'm listening to the strain of the engine and scraping noises of the bucket of a front loader in my crazy neighbor's yard. After a decade with this background noise, I'm moving back to the city. I'll be moving to a tree-lined street in a vibrant neighborhood that is much quieter than my little house in the country.
This is Will Brown from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My soundtrack would be Donald Trump saying, "I'm really, really rich" on repeat all the time.
I'm really rich. 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 I'm really rich.
Statesboro, Georgia. I live out in the boonies of rural South Georgia, and when I step outside, besides a random car or a train off in the distance, I hear the symphony of nature. Bernie Krause, who we will speak to later this hour, knows that symphony very well.
These soundscapes are narratives of places. And we've got to pay some attention how important they are, not only to science, but also to culture. And it's kind of Rosetta Stone, and we've just temporarily forgot the key. And we're learning about these things just now.
That's Bernie Krause, who, as the founder of the field of soundscape ecology, records the changing sounds of the wild. All that coming up here on The Takeaway.
At WNYC, we rely on listener support. But what exactly does that mean?
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Sancada, the program director at WNYC. To me, listener support means you're a partner with us. The news, the information, the types of conversations you hear on WNYC, without your contribution, it doesn't happen. And you know, I like it that way. We are beholden to you. That's what keeps WNYC strong.
Show your support. Go to WNYC.org and click on Donate.
WNYC receives support from Atlantic Theatre Company, presenting Cloud 9 by British playwright Carol Churchill. Set in colonial Africa and 1979 London, this play is about power, politics, family, Queen Victoria, and sex. Tickets at atlantictheatre.org. WNYC is a media partner for the New York Moth Story Slam, a storytelling competition featuring the theme Bizarre. Tonight at the Morgan Library. Details at themoth.org.
You're listening to The Takeaway from WNYC and PRI Public Radio International, in collaboration with the New York Times and WGBH Boston Public Radio.
Pope Francis has called on European nations to put humanitarian principles ahead of national interest to confront the refugee crisis in the Middle East and Europe. Activists in the United States want to remind the Pope that internal politics and gridlock here have produced a humanitarian crisis for migrant families in America. 100 women, many of them undocumented immigrants, are walking 100 miles to Washington, D.C. this week to draw attention to America's broken immigration system and deliver a message for the Pope's visit to the U.S. Takeaway correspondent Todd Zwillick has been walking with these women in northern Maryland. Their sturdy new shoes, 20 miles into the trip, he says, will have a few more miles on them by the time they get inside the Beltway.
I'm standing alongside the Heritage Trail. This is an old abandoned railway bed that's now a recreational trail in rural Maryland. We're about 8 or 9 miles south of the Pennsylvania border in the country. I'm with about 100 women, well, maybe about 100, it's hard to tell exactly, marching 100 miles from Pennsylvania all the way down to Washington, D.C. to meet Pope Francis when he's in town. These women, many of them are recent migrants themselves, many are undocumented, some are American citizens, but they're here, they say, to bring attention to the lives and the families of immigrants, to what they go through to get here, to their economic situations, and really many of them say just to their humanity.
I'm in pain, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and it's my family, and it's my son, and it's my husband. But this is our suffering, this is what we carry, this is our story. So if we don't show it, they're never gonna see it, and they're never gonna hear it. That's why I'm walking 100 miles. My name is Esmeralda Dominguez. I am from Denver, Colorado. I was born in Mexico. I'm an American citizen born outside the U.S. My husband is undocumented. I have a special needs child, and I'm also cancer survivor for stomach, and I'm facing bone cancer right now.
Is there a danger now that your husband will be deported? Is there a danger that you'll be separated?
Yes. He's my caretaker. He's my everything. He's the one that provides care for me while I'm home, doing my chemotherapy. He's my main support. He takes care of not just me, but my child. He also, he's an active member of the community. So it is, danger. It's affecting me because without him, I don't have anybody else to turn to.
You're getting paid. People should open their hearts, like the Pope said, and understand that immigrants are human beings that deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And we are just looking for an opportunity, and we just want to live in peace with our families. My name is Rosie Carrasco. I'm from Chicago, and I'm part of the Organized Communities Against Deportations, OCA.
I was told that you're undocumented yourself.
Yes.
You're not afraid of having a clash with the authorities, or are you?
I learned from my daughters that you do not have to be afraid. You have to be strong. You have to let people know that we are here, that we are part of this community, and we are living here. So there must be a solution. Instead of hate, should be open the doors to immigrants that already are living here. We already are working. We have our houses. We have our children. We have our families.
Mi nombre es Ana Cañengues y vivo en Utah. Para mí fue muy difícil tomar. I've lived here for 13 years. Well, more than 13 years. For me, it was really hard to make that decision of migrating, especially because my children were very young. But it was what was necessary because I couldn't make enough money back in my country for their food. So after 8 years that I was able to finally be with my children again, and I thought I was finally gonna be able to enjoy this country, we began a new stage in our lives because we entered into the immigration system. When I had to leave to Mexico to look for my 2 children, and I was fighting for them because they were in a detention center for children in Mexico. And when I was able to have them back with me and we started our way up here, we were lost in the desert with my children for 3 days, and I had to call Border Patrol to rescue us. And this is when a horrible nightmare began, and this odyssey of